Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Thursday night history talks we have going on with the Milwaukee County Historical Society. We're also co-presenting tonight with the Groman Museum in Milwaukee. We have a really exciting program coming up about the Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee, and Tom Fehring is going to be giving that talk here very quickly. You can see the image of his book up on the screen as well. If you're interested in purchasing Tom's book tonight, we do have that for sale at milwaukeehistory.net. And as soon as Tom gets going, I'll make sure to post that link in the comments so that you can purchase that book as well. All the proceeds go back to the Milwaukee County Historical Society, which we really appreciate on that. It is a tough time right now for nonprofits, but especially historical nonprofits, because you can't come visit all the cool exhibits that we have at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. So I'd also like to, I guess, request would be the word, that if you really enjoyed tonight's presentation, please go to milwaukeehistory.net and consider donating to our mission, as we hope to make it to the other side of this COVID-19 crisis as well. It's important that we have the community, that being you, who is enjoying what we're doing and putting on our content tonight. So thank you for your support in just tuning in tonight, though, too. We have a really interesting talk ahead of us. Next week, we have another guy from our Historical Society, our archivist, Steve Schaffer. He'll be doing a presentation on a bunch of the cool photography that's been done in Milwaukee over the years. So make sure to tune in again next Thursday night for that. We'll pop up a Facebook event here in the next couple days to make sure that you can see that as well. All right, so let's get into it. Our speaker tonight, we'll bring him into our screen here. His name is Tom Fehring. He's a history and heritage chairman for the American Society for Mechanical Engineers, and he wrote the book that I was just talking about called The Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. Fehring is an engineer by training and practice, having worked for 35 years keeping the lights on at Wisconsin Energy Corporation and its various subsidiaries. Early in his career, he was also worked for times at the Falk Corporation, Briggs Stratton, and the Ford Motor Company. So we have quite the talk in for us with a lot of knowledge that Tom's going to bring us here. So I guess to start, Tom, to get into your presentation, why is Milwaukee's industrial history important?
Okay, well, thanks, John, and thanks for this opportunity. And welcome to my man cave, if you will. This is obviously an interesting way to give presentation, and I do appreciate being afforded the opportunity. You know, John, to answer that question, I looked through some census data and found, consistently a very high percentage of Milwaukeeans were employed in manufacturing. In fact, if you look, for example, in 1950, 42% of the people that were employed in Milwaukee were working in manufacturing. And if you add to that people from other companies that supported those manufacturing companies, so accountants and lawyers, people that worked in marketing, shipping, energy security, that direct footprint of manufacturing in Milwaukee probably exceeded 50%. And then when you consider those 50% of Milwaukeeans also purchased homes, food for their tables, sent their children to school, they supported their local churches and other charities, certainly their local bars, food stores, all those types of things. You can see that footprint was very, very significant. So Milwaukee, manufacturing in Milwaukee was very, very important to the growth of the city. It also attracted a lot of people to the area, and certainly waves of immigrants came to Milwaukee principally because there were good paying jobs available. Initially, the Germans, the Irish, Polish, other Eastern European countries were attracted to the city. And then, especially during the Second World War, African Americans from mainly the southern states moved to Milwaukee. Again, because there were good, affordable, or jobs that were essentially family supporting. And while a lot of the laborers had to work to get the benefits that they ultimately acquired, and sometimes strikes and the like. But generally, a single individual in a family could support that family with a manufacturing job. So another point here, the founders and owners of Milwaukee Manufacturing also supported the arts, the education, religious institutions, numerous other charities in Milwaukee. And in fact, some of their foundations continue to support charities in the Milwaukee area. So I would say that the history of Milwaukee is not complete without including the city's industrial heritage. And you'll see the approach that I've taken in putting together the history of Milwaukee is kind of in reverse order than what is generally done. Generally, when people talk about the history of manufacturing, the history of the industrial base in Milwaukee, they usually start with the company's history, how the companies were formed, who worked for the companies, what were some of their products. I've frankly taken it the other direction because I think it's very, very important to highlight innovation. This quote from economist Robert Snow is one of my favorite. Innovation is the engine of American prosperity. Up to 80% of modern economic growth arises from technological innovation. For about the last 40 years, I've been looking into the innovations in Milwaukee, which leads me to some of the great machines, some of the the largest machinery or the most efficient or the most innovative machines. And about 5 years ago, I decided, I've got all of this research information about the innovations in Milwaukee. I ought to try to put it together into a book. And ultimately, about 3 years ago, I published this book, The Magnificent Machines of Milwaukee. It highlights this period of time from 1860, so right around the U.S. Civil War time until 1960, so right after the Second World War, if you will. And in taking this approach, I started by featuring the significant innovations that led to some of the incredible machinery that was built in Milwaukee. And as I was putting that together, I thought, well, it's not complete unless I highlight the innovators that really did that. So who are these people that created these machines? And then it occurred to me, that's not complete unless I also talk about the histories of the industrial company. In many cases, the innovations led to the formation of companies. So that's the approach that I took to essentially show how and why Milwaukee grew the way it did around these manufacturing companies. And then finally, and fairly late in the game, it occurred to me that it might be interesting to look at that 100 years of history in Milwaukee and see what insights that might provide that perhaps could be used to help revitalize the climate for innovation in Milwaukee in the future. So that's what ultimately resulted in the process. The book itself grew from what I anticipated being about 150 pages to about 450 pages. A lot of photographs and illustrations, and so as John indicated, the book is available. Please give it some thought, because I'm only going to be able to essentially scratch the surface here. One other point about the book is, as I was looking for organization, how do I put all this together, it occurred to me that maybe it'd be interesting to talk about Milwaukee's industrial neighborhoods. You see on this map pinpoints, and essentially these points represent where these early Milwaukee companies were located. And essentially Milwaukee's earliest manufacturing occurred near the Milwaukee River, right on the banks of the Milwaukee River, which is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this subset of the book. But many of the companies then moved down into the Walker's Point area. And then ultimately, as they got landlocked in the Walker's Point area, then they started following the railroad tracks, essentially, going up the Beer Line to the north, going up the 30th Street corridor, going west, going south. Essentially, most of these manufacturing companies needed access to rail to get their goods in and out, and as a result, they largely followed the railroad tracks. So for this evening's presentation, I want to talk about some of the earliest manufacturing in Milwaukee, and then follow that north along the banks of the Milwaukee River. So let's get started with that. As this slide says, the genesis of industry in Milwaukee can be traced to the ill-fated Milwaukee and Rock River Canal. I'm sure that Brian Kilborn, increased laugh from the names, will resonate with probably everybody listening here. Both of those individuals had worked for of time on the Erie Canal and several other canals. And they were attracted to Milwaukee principally because of their interest in building a canal that they envisioned going from downtown Milwaukee, right on the banks of the Milwaukee River, if you will, to the Rock River, which is, for those of you in this area, if you travel out to Madison, it's about halfway to Madison. The advantage of the Rock River is if we could have a water transportation route between downtown Milwaukee and the Rock River, it'd be possible to take that, and then the Rock River ultimately connects to the Mississippi River. So you could have a water transportation route that would have gone from Milwaukee all the way to the Gulf states, and that would have expanded an existing water route that allowed people to take the Erie Canal from eastern New York to go all the way across New York to the Great Lakes and follow the Great Lakes to Milwaukee. So that would have been a very, very interesting water transportation route. And of course, in that era, water transportation was very, very critical. What changed all of their plans, and they only were able to build about a mile of that canal. Two things got in the way. One is the initial construction was very, very difficult. They ran into rock, as people know in the downtown area. You don't have to go too deep before you run into the rock strata. And so it was a very expensive, the first mile they went. The other thing that got in the way, and you can see it in this picture, if you look down right about there, you see a railroad coming down the tracks. All of a sudden, steam railway transportation became economic, became available, and much more affordable than the cost of building canals. What this photograph shows, by the way, is the Milwaukee River in the background over here, this 1 mile of canal that was built, and a narrow strip of land located between the two. The canal itself was fed from water above the North Avenue Dam. They actually built a dam for the canal at about North Avenue. So the water source for the canal was the higher point in the canal, if you will, so that the water level in the canal was higher than the water level in the Milwaukee River. The Milwaukee River, of course, went over the dam, continued to flow, continued to go downhill toward Lake Michigan, if you will. The fact that there was an elevation difference afforded the possibility of installing hydropower between the two water sources. So while this canal was never completed, by 1943, industry was already being powered by water using the head generated by the North Avenue Dam. By 1950, there were at least 25 companies that were located using the water power made available from the canal. This is another view, view from a different direction. But here you can see the canal again, the Milwaukee River located here. The North Avenue Dam presumably is up here someplace. Another view of that same thing. Here's the canal and the Milwaukee River. And you can see these companies that were located on this narrow strip of land. We don't know much about most of those companies. Presumably they were flour mills, grist mills, probably some lumber operations, maybe some furniture companies, all located there because they could get the water power, use that to drive their line shafts, use that to drive their equipment. There was one company in particular called the Smith and Burge Mill, located at 454 Canal. I'm not sure exactly where that is, but presumably in this narrow strip right over here. Just one of the mills along the canal, but it had two very, very important aspects with regard to Milwaukee's manufacturing history. The first of those starts with James Paris Lee. James Paris Lee was, as a young lad, he came with his parents from Scotland in 1831. I believe they lived for a while in Canada before moving south into Wisconsin. As a young lad, the story is that James Paris Lee had interest in firearms, interest in building his own and modifying them. And I think he had an accident with one of his early firearms. It blew up as he was discharging it, and he got some facial lacerations and things. But that didn't dissuade him. He continued to work on innovative designs for firearms. Shortly after coming to Milwaukee, he developed a rifled musket with a breech-loading cartridge mechanism. That sounds pretty confusing, but let me explain that. This is an illustration, a photograph of what his firearm looked like. Milwaukee Public Museum has this prized rifle in its collection. I believe there may also be another one in the Wisconsin Historical Society's museum in Madison. Because of its innovative nature, during the Civil War, the U.S. Army ordered 1,000 of these rifles, and James Paris Lee had to find an opportunity, had to create these, so he rented this former mill in order to construct his rifle. To show it how it works, this is his patent drawing looking down on the rifle, and this is the wooden stock, if you would, that would sit against a person's shoulder as they're using the gun. This is the barrel, and you can see a pivot point that would allow that you can insert a cartridge into the barrel, close it up so that it's all in line. There was a latch mechanism that hold it securely in place. Fire the rifle, open it up, take out the discharge the cartridge, put in a new cartridge. So you can see that it could be fired fairly rapidly, and because of that, the U.S. Army was quite interested in using it during the Civil War. James Paris Lee had a problem, though. He could manufacture almost all aspects of the mechanism, but he could not bore it nor rifle it. The technology, the capabilities in Milwaukee at that time did not provide those capabilities. And I don't know if everybody's familiar with rifling. The reason a rifle has that term is that in addition to boring the barrel, if you will, it's very desirable to put a spiral groove to machine it into the surface of the barrel. And by doing that when you fire the gun, it puts a spin on the bullet, if you will, and having a spin improves the accuracy. And since he didn't have this capability, he used access to Remington, located in Ilion, New York. Well, why Ilion, New York? Two things. Remington had the capability, of course. Remington was a firearms manufacturer, and Ilion, New York was located on the Erie Canal. So there was a water route between Milwaukee and the Erie Canal, so that perhaps 8 to 9 months of the year, it was possible to get goods and services going back and forth. Unfortunately, there was a misunderstanding that caused the barrels to be delivered with the wrong size bore, and they were rejected by the U.S. Army. James Paris Lee manufactured 255 rifles, each of which is very, very prized, very valuable today, in part because, certainly it was a very interesting rifle, but also because Lee himself eventually turned out to be one of the 19th century's greatest gun designers. He obtained a patent in 1879 for the vertical box magazine, and it was continued to be a very significant advance in firearms. He found a way to avoid cartridge detonations in the tube magazines and the like, and because of that, he was very highly regarded for his armament design capabilities. The second use of that mill was for the manufacture of the typewriter. I'm sure as most of us as being Milwaukeeans, we know the story. Christopher Latham Sholes emigrated from Pennsylvania to Wisconsin in 1837. He was a newspaper publisher, a politician, served in the Wisconsin State Senate, the Wisconsin State Assembly. While he was in the legislature, he was instrumental in abolishing the capital punishment in Wisconsin. He also was the editor of the Milwaukee Sentinel. And for those of you from the city of Milwaukee, if you recognize where the Journal Sentinel is located right now, the Milwaukee Sentinel at one time was located there. About a block away from that location was this little machine shop called Klein snoopers. Klein snoopers would probably best be described as a job shop. They didn't make any of their own products. They provided services for the nearby companies that were located on the Milwaukee River. So if you look at this photograph, you can see they were a brass foundry. They made wooden patterns. They made miscellaneous machinery. Probably everything they made, however, was for other companies. So other companies would job out some of their parts to help them in their manufacturing. Which was very unusual, they appear to have encouraged would-be inventors to use space in their facility to tinker with their developments. And it was probably one of the earliest examples of what we now refer to as an incubator in the United States. We know that in this facility, a guy named Carlos Glidden was working on designs for a steam-driven rotary plow and a mechanical spade. Matthias Schwalbach here was working on designs for sewing machines and designs for clocks. And Christopher Latham Sholes had already developed a page numbering device and a newspaper addressing machine. His page numbering device, as I understand it, was a single key that could be depressed. And as it was depressed, a number would rotate so that he could use that for printing number one on a page and turn for the next page. Print, depress the key, print number 2, page number 3, page number 4. Having developed that device, the story is that one of his associates came in one day with an article of the Scientific American in which they were speculating about the people trying to design typewriters. Christopher Latham Sholes certainly was not the first to attempt to build a typewriter. Or even the first to build a model typewriter. But they encouraged him, hey, Christopher, you've got this page numbering device with a single key. Geez, what if you had a key for every letter of the alphabet? Perhaps you could arrange it such that you could put print down on paper. And indeed, after a short period of time, Christopher Latham Sholes obtained a patent for the device that's shown on the right here. This is his actual patent model. He, like a good number of other people that were trying to develop a device like this, started with a piano-type keyboard with all the keys kind of arranged like this. You can see as each key is depressed, it would pull up a lever. The lever would strike on the bottom of this platen here. It used a square flat platen so that a piece of paper would travel across the top of this device, and of course it had many deficiencies. One is it could only print on very, very thin paper. You wouldn't see anything as you typed your entire letter. You wouldn't see any of what you had typed or have any ability to correct it until you were done with that page. What he started to do, however, is Christopher Latham Sholes and others in the team, they started sending out letters that were typed on the device to various people that could potentially invest in their enterprise. And by doing that, he attracted a guy named James Densmore. Densmore, sight unseen, all he had was this little flyer that was typewritten. But he decided that he'd be interested in investing in this proposition, and he traveled to Milwaukee. The word is that he was fairly crestfallen when he actually saw how rude the device was. And he said, guys, I'd be interested in investing in this, but if I'm going to invest in this enterprise, you've got to come up with a much more usable device. It took him about 5 years before, and by the way, they went through many iterations of devices, and they tested the devices, they got feedback, they sent them out to be used by various people. They ultimately began creating a device and manufacturing it at that Smith and Burge mill with Matthias Schwalbach in charge of the production activities. And it's the device shown here on right. And, I think you look at this device, you can see that, indeed, this is a typewriter. In fact, it had the QWERTY keyboard. It looks pretty crude. It's obviously got a wooden case. They manufactured at about 30, maybe as many as 50 of these typewriters. They were trying to sell them for about $50, and it was a difficult sell, and it was expensive for them to produce them because it was not a very highly mechanized process. So they decided after a period of time, and it was principally James Densmore's urgings, he contacted Remington. And again, Remington was available on the Erie Canal. They went with one of their typewriters and showed it to Remington, and Remington was impressed enough with the device that they agreed to contract with the Sholes and Glidden team. So, the Sholes and Glidden team essentially subcontracted the construction of the typewriter to Remington. It was sold with the Sholes and Glidden name on it. You can see that it morphed from this wooden case to a decorated metal case. Remington, in addition to making firearms, was also making typewriters. And early typewriter, I'm sorry, it was also making sewing machines. And early sewing machines had this type of look with typically a black stamped metal with some fancy scripting and flowering and things like that. This was a very, very significant innovation. It was the first commercially successful typewriter. It took a while before sales took off. People didn't quite know what to make of it. And in fact, the Sholes and Glidden team itself, they were trying to market the device to writers. Mark Twain had one for a while and didn't have much. He kept lending it to friends and stuff. It was kind of a novel innovation. He didn't think it was particularly useful for his typing capabilities. Eventually, business recognized how valuable it could be to have the device in the office. Remington, as they saw the potential, they purchased the copyrights and the production rights from the team. And James Densmore got fairly rich from the sale. By that time, I think James Densmore owned about 94% or so of the enterprise because all of his investment, all the money, all the funding that went into during that period of development was funded by Densmore. And of course, by doing that, it diluted the interest in the other innovators. Sholes got, relatively a pittance compared to what James Densmore got. Remington initially, in seeing the potential for use of the typewriter in the office environment, began opening schools and also promoting the use of the typewriter in schools. So people would learn how to type, people would learn touch typing, they would learn the basics for formatting office letters and the like. And by doing that, the schools ended up being largely, the students were largely women, and the women coming out of those schools ended up in the office environment. And it really was the first time that the office environment largely was opened up to women. So it caused a significant social change by itself, not only in the United States, but pretty much worldwide. It also ended up with, one other quirky thing, if you will. The initial typewriter with this QWERTY display was largely established, we think, in order to avoid jamming or minimize jamming of the typewriter, and it persisted. Here we are sitting 150 years later or so. Here's Steve Jobs, for example, when he was demonstrating the initial iPad, and he shows a keyboard with the QWERTY. I think most of our smartphones, the keypads are largely established the same way. So we've got to thank the Sholes and Glidden team for the layout of the basic keyboard. Recognizing the importance of the typewriter, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers landmarked the development in 2011. The Milwaukee Public Museum is fortunate enough to have 3 or 4 of these typewriters and put one in a fancy display case. The typewriter initially came with a little stand, and most of the typewriters initially had a lever, a foot lever, to move the carriage across. When we were getting ready for this landmark ceremony, we tried to contact descendants of Christopher Latham Sholes and James Densmore and Sam Suley and Glidden, all of the people that were involved. We figured if we could find some of their descendants, they might be interested. And we struck out. But then we started looking for Schwalbachs. And Matthias Schwalbach, I believe he outlived 3 wives and had 17 kids or something like that. And it looks like most of them stayed in Milwaukee because landmark ceremony, we probably had 50 people from the Schwalbach family, and they were delighted to be there and recognize the contributions that Schwalbach made in the machine. Let's move along on Milwaukee River now. Other industries very quickly began locating on the bank of the Milwaukee River. You can see these initial mills were located upstream here, just south of the North Avenue Dam. And if you look downstream on the same western bank of the Milwaukee River, you can see a number of smokestacks appear. And what was happening by the mid-1800s is the steam engine was becoming available, was becoming affordable, and that allowed manufacturers to use the steam engine as their motive force. They wouldn't necessarily have to be right on the river itself. And very, very quickly, there was a transformation. One of the companies that was located in that strip of land was the Decker and Seville factory. They were founded in 1847. They called their company the Reliance Works. And you can see that they were, they made stoves and machinery and blacksmith work, meal furnishings, a very early Milwaukee manufacturer and a fairly small enterprise. They ended up going into bankruptcy. And in 1861, a guy named Edward P. Ellis acquired the Reliance Works at a sheriff's sale. Ellis had moved to Milwaukee in 1846 at a fairly young age. He was investing in some of the tanneries. He decided to diversify. He had sold, I believe, the tannery that he was involved in and was looking for an investment opportunity. And he acquired the Decker and Seville Works at the sheriff's sale with the intention of expanding it. And expand he did, and very, very quickly and aggressively. One of the first things he did is he actually moved the plant lock, stock, and barrel to the Walker's Point area. He was landlocked essentially on the banks of the Milwaukee River, and he needed more room. And he actually literally floated a couple of the prime factory buildings down the Milwaukee River. He became the most prominent Milwaukee manufacturer over a period of time. Edward P. Ellis, eventually merged his company into the Chalmers, or merged with the Chalmers company out of Chicago, forming Ellis Chalmers. And ultimately, they moved into West Ellis and became the largest manufacturer in Milwaukee. I could spend an hour talking about some of the significant innovations out of that company, but for the time available here, I'd like to just talk about one of their innovations, because it's tied to the Milwaukee River. By the late 1800s, the Milwaukee River had become increasingly polluted, and especially during the summer months, in which, if it hadn't rained for a while, between the warmer temperatures and the lack of flow, it became pretty much an open sewer. And the city of Milwaukee engineers were looking for a solution to that, and their solution at the time, the solution to pollution, was dilution. Can we dilute the water in the Milwaukee River? Can we add additional water and essentially flush the river? So they contracted with the P Ellis company. Their principal engineer at the time, Edwin Reynolds, designed what was the world's largest pump at the time. It was installed in, trying to find the words, 1888. You can see the steam engine that Edwin designed for it, and that steam engine rotated this shaft. The shaft itself was a centrifugal pump that was located in a, essentially a mile tunnel to go from the city's lakefront to the Milwaukee River. It was recognized as a landmark by ASME in 1972 because it was the world's largest pump at the time. Many of us in Milwaukee will recognize the facility today. It now houses TiVo Coffee on Milwaukee Lakefront. If you ever visit the facility, stop and take a look at, there's a landmark plaque located on the wall right at about midpoint in the front face of it. If you look inside what is now the coffee shop portion, the retail portion of the coffee shop was the original boiler room for the pump house. And then on the other side of the wall, if you will, and it's open to the public with signage and like, you'll be able to look down into the pit. Steam engine used to be located right at this point, and over the years eventually became economic to convert that to an electric motor, which is driving a Falk gear drive. And then at the end of this shaft and in the tunnel continues to be this centrifugal pump, which even all these years later, so 130 some years or so later, continues to be used occasionally in the summer months when it's desirable to increase the oxygen content in the Milwaukee River. Significant development. Also along the Milwaukee River, you may recognize this facility. This is part of the Milwaukee's theater district. This building right here in the foreground is where the Milwaukee Rep is located, one of their buildings. They're also used part of this facility as well. This facility was originally a power plant constructed to serve the electric and steam needs of downtown Milwaukee. It was built actually in 3 different phases. And by the mid-19-teens, so in 1915, 1917, it was already getting to the point where it was unable to meet the needs of the system. So the company at that time, which was the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company, had decided to build a new power plant on the shores of Lake Michigan down in St. Francis, which became the Lakeside Power Plant. But before they began construction, they decided they would like to use a new technology if possible. Prior to experiments that were conducted in 1917 at this EastWest power plant, boilers all looked pretty much like as shown in this illustration, and it had a traveling grate. Coal would be placed onto the traveling grate. It would burn, it would burn, it would burn, and when it would get to the end of the grate, it would fall into the ash pit, if you will. And you'd maybe burn 80–85% or so of the coal. A lot of the unburned coal was just wasted and discarded. And for a long period of time, people thought, well, if there would be the ability to grind the coal into and pulverize it into fine powder form, you'd be able to burn it under suspension the way you burn oil or the way you burn gas, and significantly increase the efficiency. But they had been unable to do that. And the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light Company at the time gave a couple of its engineers the use of one of the boilers and said, go at it, see if you can find a way to burn pulverized coal. And over a period of several months, they figured, the real problem was if you dropped and blew pulverized coal down into a burner, that heat of combustion is so high that you needed more and more furnace volume. So they increased the furnace volume. They actually increased the furnace volume all the way down to the basement floor, and they were running out of space. They added air passages. The heat of combustion was still too high, and they ultimately began taking water tubes and essentially ringing the firebox with water tubes, and that proved to be successful. And not only did the water tubes, of course, protect the fire brick and allow it to contain the heat of combustion coming from the burning of the pulverized coal, but it added, of course, efficiency to the cycle because you were picking up that energy. The energy then, the water tubes would go through the boiler walls, if you will, up into the drum. At the top of the drum, steam comes off, and steam powers your steam turbines and steam engines at that time. Their experiments were widely witnessed by the industry and and began very quickly to be adopted by the rest of the industry. The entire mechanism, there were pulverizers located up in the higher elevations. The pulverized coal was transported into a hopper and then fed down and was essentially blown into the boiler. And it achieved much higher efficiency, and it did one other thing. Boilers up until that time, their size was limited to the size available by this traveling grate. And once you could burn things on a pulverized coal basis, boilers could become huge, and the economics of scale reduced the cost of the production of electricity. So as it says, it allowed almost unlimited boiler sizes, and the resulting economics of scale significantly reduced the cost of electricity. This is the price of electricity between 1920 and 1970, and you can see it started, it was reduced by 3.5 times or so. And that reduction was extremely important worldwide. By reducing the cost of electricity, all of a sudden electricity was available to be used in manufacturing. It was being able to use for home use. It really contributed to a dramatic change by how we energize our facilities. It was recognized as a landmark by ASME in 1980 because of its significance. If you ever visit the Milwaukee Rep, and I'm sure many of you do, the theater seating area, you can see, as I've highlighted here, the boilers at one time were located in what is now the backstage area, and because of that, they've been removed, of course. Going up the river, I want to talk about Christiansen Engineering. Niles Christensen came to Chicago as a relatively young lad, and while there, he witnessed a streetcar accident, which got him thinking, as most engineers do, when you see a problem, you find a solution to it. And he developed a braking system for streetcars using compressed air. To explain this a little bit, before doing that, while down in Chicago, he met P Ellis at the Columbian Exposition, and Ellis convinced Niles Christensen to come work for him in Milwaukee, and which he did, although eventually he left P Ellis to form his own company. I thought it'd be helpful to kind of show a chaotic street scene in Milwaukee. Where you see a streetcar coming down its tracks, you can see horse-drawn carriages, you can see people walking across the street, and this is on a good day. When you throw in a mixture of snow and rain and all kinds of weather conditions, you can see that there may be opportunities where the streetcar operator's got to be very, very careful and may have to hit the brake very quickly. Streetcars by this time, of course, they were electric powered, and if they lost their connection to the line, perhaps through an accident, they largely lost braking capacity. The streetcar operator had a lever. He could mechanically pull on his lever as hard as he could, but in many cases couldn't stop the streetcar in time. Christensen's system provided essentially, by providing a pressurized air cylinder in each of the streetcars. If the electricity line was lost, you could still safely brake and stop the streetcar. His braking system was widely adopted. You can see this. This is the St. Charles streetcar line down in New Orleans. Many tourists, of course, have the opportunity to see that. This is the braking lever. There's a patent drawing, another view of this braking lever, and this is the pressure gauge off of the pneumatic system. The demand for the device was significant, and Christiansen Engineering built a fairly significant factory on the banks of the Milwaukee River. This is now the site of the Urban Ecology Center, and the Rotary Park is located right on the shores, right in the banks of the Milwaukee River right now. I think one of these buildings, I think it might be this building, is still located on the site, but all the rest of it is largely gone. But you can see this was a very significant enterprise in its day. Christensen approached the company in kind of a novel way. He interested investors in the company to pay him for the use of his patents. But he didn't have any ownership right of that. And that ended up working to his detriment because he was ultimately sued by the Westinghouse air brake company. George Westinghouse, of course, had created an air brake for railroads, and Westinghouse felt that Christensen had abridged his patents. And Westinghouse eventually was able to acquire all the stock in the company right out from under Christensen. He renamed it the National Brake and Electric Company. It continued to operate for quite a few years, but Christensen, of course, was out. Christensen reestablished his own company and outsourced his manufacturing to Ellis Chambers, and they competed for a while in the streetcar braking business. The battle was ultimately fought in the courts, and it went for 24 years. And incredibly, there were 3 different trips to the Supreme Court. And I'm not sure of all the circumstances of that. Christensen, by the way, ultimately won this battle. And but after 24 years, he had a lengthy period of time in which he ended up going into other enterprises. He developed a pneumatic starting system for automotive and aircraft engines, and had a successful business doing that for a number of years. You can see he moved his facility to 30th Street in Milwaukee. He ultimately left Milwaukee for Cleveland to develop air brakes for trucks, as well as he had a conversion kit to convert Model A Fords, Model T Fords, and put pneumatic braking systems on there. And then at the age of 72, he had largely retired, and he was tinkering around at his own home workshop, working on a sealing mechanism. His entire career had been working using pneumatic systems and always having to deal with leaky seals and like, and he ultimately developed the perfect formulas for O-rings. And he began marketing his O-ring product to a number of companies. He signed a contract with United Aircraft. Aircraft landing gear has a significant need for sealing systems on its hydraulic systems and like. And I think Christensen figured, okay, I'm finally going to get rich. I've sold my patent to United Aircraft. I can sell it to others. And then Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the government considered it a key patent. Christensen got a lump sum payment, and he had to wait until the war was over. He ultimately sued the United States government, I think because when the war ended, he didn't get his patents right in time. So in 1971, 19 years after he died, he ultimately won that battle as well. Niles Christensen was innovative. He was also persistent. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly through some of the rest here because we're running out a little time. But this is a picture of Oscar Warwath, who founded the School of Engineering, ultimately became the Milwaukee School of Engineering. You can see him in his electric-driven vehicle, probably the first in Milwaukee. And one of his enterprises was to form enterprises, if you will, for students to earn tuition by building things. And they developed, one of their products was electric storage batteries, and their storage batteries were fairly successful. And the demand eventually exceeded the capacity of the school, and Warwath sold the company to a group of investors who formed Globe Electric, and they moved to the River West neighborhood, so right off the banks of the Milwaukee River. Globe ultimately merged with Union Battery to become Globe Union. Their most significant innovation, was probably the battery that ultimately became Sears Diehard. They developed a polypropylene thin wall case, and the fact that it was much thinner than a conventional hard rubber case allowed them to pack more juice, if you will, more power into the size of the battery, giving it a higher content. So it was a very successful battery. They also, and probably not nearly as well known, they had a division called Central Lab that during the Second World War, Central Lab was asked to design a proximity fuse for cannon shells. They ultimately employed, now this had to be a very small circuit board, if you will. They developed a ceramic circuit board that was screen printed with metallic paint and conductors, and they used carbon materials for resistors. The technology ultimately became known as a thick film hybrid circuits, but it was the basic technology that a lot of modern electronic devices were built on. It was very, very secretive at the time, and was very successful. By the way, this you can see the illustration. You can see a bomb, and the end of it. And this device that had the proximity sensor was probably 3 inches long or so. Essentially a radar device. It was looking ahead, so that it would detonate the bomb right before it would hit its ultimate target. And by doing that, would maximize the destruction. It was very critical during the Battle of the Bulge and during certain engagements in the Pacific Front. Many, many years later, Harry Rubenstein, who was one of the principal innovators of that, was awarded the award, and they finally were able to talk about it publicly. There's another way where Central Lab became pretty interesting. In 1947, so after the war, they hired this guy, Jack Kilby. Kilby came out of, I believe, Ohio State as a licensed engineer, and they put him to work because they were using the same technology to build hearing aids. And miniature circuits, if you will, although they're miniature circuits for hearing aids, were by today's standards huge. But in any case, Jack Kilby was working on this, and he was taking night courses, ultimately got his master's degree in Milwaukee. They sent him away to learn how to build transistors, and he began building transistors in Central Lab for their operations. He was doing quite successfully. But then right after 1957, he was brought in for his year-end review, and he was told by his boss, Jack, you've been doing a great job. You've earned a bonus this year. Here's your bonus check. And just between us, the business isn't looking real good. We know there's going to be some sort of a force reduction. You might want to look around. Well, Jack started looking around, and he found a job opportunity for this company down in Texas, in the Dallas area, called Texas Instruments. He left Central Lab in May of '58, got down there, and they ended up going on taking their vacation break, and they were, Texas Instrument would essentially shut down for 2 weeks so everybody could take their vacations. Jack hadn't earned any vacations, so Jack stayed in the lab. And weeks after joining Texas Instrument, he used that period of time to develop the world's first microchip. Probably one of the great inventions, certainly the great inventions of the 20th century. It didn't look like much, but this was the chip that changed the world. And you got to figure that a lot of the innovation, a lot of the expertise, was things that he had learned at Central Lab, and unfortunately wasn't there long enough to put it in place before he left for Texas Instrument. Moving in, also in the River West neighborhood, was a company called Delta Manufacturing. It was founded in 1919 by Herbert Taltz. Taltz had immigrated to Milwaukee from Germany in 1914. He worked as a lathe operator for a while. He went through a whole series of jobs, and at the same time, he was going to night school. He was learning English and basic bookkeeping and the like. And he was working out of his garage on various innovations. He had a lot of creative opportunities, creative ideas. His first couple of them didn't pan out. But around Christmas time, walking, I think it may have been near Schuster's or something back in those days, he came across a little German toy sewing machine. And he says, I could make one of those. And he designed and patented something he called the American Girl sewing machine. The toy sewing machine, I'm a proud owner of one of them myself, so I can play around with it and show it to my grandkids. It was a very, very successful device in a small scale, if you will. And he starts manufacturing this device. And then a gentleman from Chicago came up that was trying to find somebody to pay him for his innovation, which was a scroll saw. And his scroll saw also used a little hand wheel, and Tots said, hey, that'd be interesting. I can have an American girl sewing machine, American boy scroll saw, a little sexist maybe, but indeed that's what he did. So he was a toy manufacturer making sewing machines, making scroll saws. And then the Depression years hit. And you would think a toy manufacturer would really struggle and perhaps go out of business. But what happened is people that were losing their jobs, they decided, I'm going to try going into woodworking and make furniture or make other things out of my basement, out of my garage. And Delta began expanding its line from not only their scroll saws, but also adding lathes and drill presses and the like. And you can hear this is a kind of an idealistic view out of their advertising, showing a father and his son making equipment, showing all this Delta equipment. Probably their biggest innovation now, that moved them, of course, into woodworking equipment big time. They sold their sewing machine line to somebody else, and but they ultimately developed a product called the Unisaw that is a very important device for cabinet making and the like. Delta continues in business to today. It's no longer located in Milwaukee, but continues to work in the business. Now, finally, I want to talk about W.S. Seaman Company, established in 1846 as a cabinet maker in Milwaukee. They were located in Walker's Point. They got a contract to build telephone booths for Western Electric, and they ended up in 1906, a fire destroyed their plant, and they leased a larger facility. A facility was much larger than what they needed, and they had additional space, so they went looking for partners to help fill the plant and help pay their lease. And they attracted a company called Petrel rather, was a motor car company, and they moved into the factory and they asked if Siemens would build the bodies for the Petrel. There were only a couple thousand Petrels built, but it launched Siemens into the automotive body business. And over the next decade, they began expanding and building car bodies for numerous companies. And they patented a metal reinforced wooden framing system. They ultimately moved more and more into pressed steel bodies and the like, and they needed additional space. And they attracted an investor. Charles Nash had acquired the Jeffrey Company in 1916 and renamed it after himself. It became the Nash Motor Company. And he purchased one half of Seaman Body and then the rest of it. And essentially, Seaman Body was to Nash what Fisher Body became to General Motors, a division responsible for all aspects of automotive body design and manufacture. They ran out of room down in the Walker's Point area and built a brand new factory on Capitol Drive in the River West neighborhood. When completed, it was the world's largest auto body assembly plant. The auto bodies were built in Milwaukee. They were transported to Kenosha, and then the engines and drivetrains were added at that point. Nash had many innovations over the years. One of their quirkiest was its bed in a car feature. They initially had a design in which an opening in the trunk is, you would sleep in the back seat and your feet would go in the trunk, and they ultimately decided, you could redesign things with this configuration. Of course, the doors are off for illustration purposes. They were the first company to provide a conditioned air system. This is not an air conditioning system, if you will. This is a heater, if you will. Many of the early automobiles essentially just blew air over the engine and into the compartment of the car. They were the first to put in a heater core itself, and they ultimately added a thermostat so you could set the temperature of the car and leave it semi-automatic. It was the first for the industry. Probably their biggest innovation was they created the first mass-produced automobile to employ unibody construction. Unibody construction is used almost universally today, certainly for all sedans, and And most SUVs are now produced using unibody construction. You can make stronger bodies, safer bodies that can be designed specifically for crashworthiness and lighter construction. They were the first to develop a automobile that was designed in a wind tunnel to reduce wind resistance, and they were the first to introduce a one-piece curved safety glass in the windshield. They also developed a instrument pod for the first time, and that gave a lot of abilities rather than having along the dashboard, if you will, all separate holes for gauges and having to produce or having to put all those gauges in service as the cars came down the production line. They were able to subcontract out and just take this one device, hook up the electric lines and the speedometer cable. And all manufacturers subsequently adopted that. There's a lot of other innovations that occurred along the banks of the Milwaukee River. You can see some of the companies listed here. And these are just, between the ones I've talked about, maybe a dozen of the 70-some companies that are highlighted in the book. You can see some of the other names that companies that are talked about in other neighborhoods, if you will, in the book. As I indicated earlier, book's got over 450 pages, a lot of illustrations, and the book's available online at the Milwaukee County Historical Society's site. It's also available at the Groman Museum, Historic Milwaukee, Boswell, and if you have to, it's available on Amazon. And if you just want to take the book out of the library and read it, and certainly you can do it that way as well. I want to end with this quote. Came out of a history of Milwaukee put together by William George Bruce. So there's great romance in Milwaukee industry. It's got its inception in the lowly condition which existed when many of our present industries were founded. Romance, he says, I tell the world it is. I don't know if all of you that are listening in today can feel that romance from Milwaukee industry, but that's what has motivated me to try to pull this all together and to tell the story. So if there's any questions, I'd be very, very happy to entertain them.
Tom, that was fantastic. I think it's so interesting that so many inventions that either have become novelties over the years or things that we think of every day got their start in Milwaukee. So I'll start off the questions.
All right.
But if anybody has any questions, put them in the comments and we'll bring them up on screen, and Tom can answer them. I'll get that here. If you would like to buy the book, I'll put the link up right now too. So there you go. You can follow along on the next one. But why do you think Milwaukee has been such a center of it for invention? Do you think there's one or two things that have led to that?
Yeah, well, there's maybe a half dozen things that led to that, and that that was the reason for that insights chapter of the book, really trying to look what made Milwaukee perhaps somewhat unique. Some of that was the proximity. All of these companies at one time, many of the companies were located in the Walker's Point area in very, very close proximity to one another. And ideas tended to walk right across the street. There's some illustrations that are pretty interesting where a crane failure at the P Ellis facility, caused the engineer working on it to walk across the street to Pauling and Harnischfigger and say, "Hey, can you make this stuff?" And Pauling and Harnischfigger, which was a job shop at that time, was very interested in getting into the crane business. So ideas would move and flow. There's some connections between Ole Evinrude and the Harley Davidson boys and things like that, where they were helping one another out, largely because they worked in proximity to one another. They lived in proximity to one another. The term that's used was an industrial commons.
Sure.
And we've lost some of that, especially in this day and age where so much of construction is now overseas and the engineering is done here. You lose that, some of the innovation flow that used to exist at one time.
it seems like it's such a like discussion, like you've described, between people, in that people are saying, hey, I wonder how I can do this better, or I have this problem and I need to solve it. What do you have?
Yeah.
And I think that's is that what drives innovation in general? That's what it feels like.
Well, certainly a lot of that, and there's also things that go. You need some experience, and innovation tends to kind of layer on one another. Somebody will develop a steam engine, and somebody improves it, and somebody improves the valving, and somebody can make it faster and make it bigger. It just, it all kind of pancakes, and so you need some of that basic experience. And there was something that Edward P. Ellis did that really created a lot of that environment. He just hired some of the very best people when he moved his company to the Walker's Point area and brought them together. And he was able to actually bring them in and pay them less than what they were earning elsewhere, because he says, I'll pay you for the use of your patents and allow you to put your name on the machines. So you get some of these guys. A lot of the engineers back then, they worked in relative obscurity.
Sure.
They were typically called draftsmen. They would put together the drawings, and so Edward P. Ellis, he was kind of one of the first ones that said, you come work for me and your name can go on the machine, and I'll pay you patent rights for the use of your equipment.
And now there's a whole city named after him.
Yeah.
That was smart business strategy then too, right?
Right.
I'm going to lead off with the audience questions, because this is my wife who's been watching in above me. I'm in the basement right now. But she says, my wife Ricky, she says, would you say there's one invention that you think defines Milwaukee?
Wow.
That's a big question.
I think the one that I think we should feel the proudest about is probably the invention of the typewriter, because it was such an innovative device and changed so many parts of society and everything. Of course, when you think of Milwaukee, though, you tend to think of the big things that Milwaukee built, and we were building the largest steam engines in the world, and a lot of that goes back to Edwin Reynolds, which was probably the most innovative steam engine builder, and he led Ellis Chalmers to prominence, essentially building steam engines at the time. And we became world renowned because of the huge steam engines that came out of Milwaukee and eventually out of West Ellis.
Sure.
I don't know if that's a fair answer to one machine.
I think so. I think it's interesting, as you're talking about just in the inventions and the innovation ideas that have come out of Milwaukee, because I feel like Milwaukee is one of those places that is known for the products that we make a lot, where we've done a lot in the meat packing industry, and we've done a lot with beer and other things like that. And to think about like what has actually been developed here is I think really significant. Lori asks, do you know how Milwaukee Road got started? That's a railroad question.
Yeah, I think, and I believe Kilbourne was an early investor of a company that was, and it ultimately, started with an earlier name, Milwaukee to, I don't want to go too far in this because I'm going to get some of the names wrong, but it just began and grew and grew, and then ultimately became an entire system. I do cover it in the book.
Yeah.
And run through the history, but I would do a disservice, I think, to try to regurgitate what's in there.
Well, you don't want to anger the railroad crowd, because that's
there is a significant section of the book about Milwaukee Road and some of its innovations, which did some very neat things, largely going to steel cars. A lot of the railroad cars, when they first got started, were wooden box cars and things like that. And of course, when you're hauling all this weight on the tracks, there's an advantage of creating steel cars that were much lighter, and so you could transport more goods and services.
Sure, absolutely. So we have Liz Fehring here. I don't know if that's a relative of yours.
She is, as a matter of fact. Hey, Liz.
She says, what industry was located where Lakefront Brewery is right now?
That actually was at one time a little power plant. that was used. It was actually part of the Milwaukee Electric Railway and Light System for a little while. It was used for testing Ellis-Chalmers turbines for a while, and it was also used to provide steam and other services to Schlitz, which was located in very short proximity to that facility. So it had kind of an interesting heritage. If you look at the facility, there was one section of the building that was the boiler room, if you will, where I think was where the brew equipment is located right now, and the part of the floor, which is the restaurant and the bar area and all that sort of stuff, was in the other part of the facility.
Sure. So I think we'll take a couple more questions, maybe two more questions. So if you have any more, you can put them in there. And I know Tom's an avid Facebooker too, so he'll go back through and find any. So Chris has a lot of stuff here. What other industries on Water Street use the river, and how did the Milwaukee Third Ward fire affect the industries? So there was a big fire that destroyed a lot of the early structures of the Third Ward, because the Irish were that moved into the Third Ward, and it decimated the entire area and then was built up again. So again, so what, how did that affect it, and what other industries on Water Street use the river?
Yeah, well, a lot of what was located on Water Street were tanneries at that time, and I frankly haven't explored tanneries much, because my interest largely has been machinery and mechanical things, if you will. But if you go up and down Water Street, you can pretty well picture most of those buildings were previous tanneries at one time. And the tanning business was very, very important trade in the city of Milwaukee.
So I'm going to end with this last question here. Jack, this is a question about you, Tom. So how did your career at Wisconsin Energies contribute to your interest in the history of Milwaukee?
Okay, well, actually, that's actually how I got involved, if you will. When I was a fairly young engineer, I think it was right around 1978 or so, my boss pulled me in one time and he says, Tom, you're young, you've got a promising career at the company, you ought to give back something to the profession. I urge you to get involved with the professional society. And I took him to heart. So I showed up at a meeting of the Milwaukee section of the mechanical engineers, and I volunteered. And they said, well, what would you like to do? And I said, well, what do you got? And he said, well, how would you like to be our history and heritage chairman? And I thought, well, that's interesting. Is there somebody that just left that position that kind of, can tell me about it, and what has he been working on, and that sort of stuff? And he says, no, we've never had one. So it's kind of a clean slate, if you will. What can you do? And I came back to the company, and of course I had the company's endorsement, and I was fortunate enough to have a secretary that had some time on her hands, and I began sending out letters to the heads of Milwaukee companies, asking them what innovations are they proud of, what things have their companies done that essentially allowed them to grow. And I accumulated a list of what ultimately became about 150 items of significant Milwaukee area innovations. And that's the approach I took.
And here you are, and you got a book out, and you had you helped curate an exhibit at the Groman Museum on all sorts of these inventions. So
John, there's also, I should mention, in I believe about July 1st, there's going to be an exhibit at the War Memorial Center in Milwaukee's lakefront. And it's going to be talking about behind the war, Milwaukee's contributions to the war. And part of that exhibit is going to be talking about Milwaukee's industrial heritage and the things that Milwaukee built to contribute to the Second World War effort, all part of the celebration of the 75th ending, the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So hopefully there will be an opportunity for folks to view that exhibit before long too.
God, we all hope so.
Yeah.
So keep a lookout for anything to do with that. Tom's book, as he mentioned, is available through many retailers. We hope you'll buy it though at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. I've posted the link a couple times in the comments there, but MilwaukeeHistory.net, and there's a shop button, and you can find that within our online bookstore, and we'll get that shipped out to you during lockdown and everything. We're still doing that. So make sure that if you enjoyed tonight's talk, you delve deeper into the topic by reading Tom's book as well. Next week we are going to be talking with Steve Schaffer, who is one of our archivists, who's like kind of a photo guru. So you see a lot of these historic photos that we put up on our Facebook page, and he's usually responsible for that. And he knows all about them. So he's doing a kind of a tour of, not a tour, but examples of some of the famous shots of Milwaukee. So next Thursday night, we'll be doing that. But Tom, thank you so much for joining us on our Thursday night Facebook chat. This was fascinating to see how Milwaukee adapted to different times, and hopefully we can continue adapting to the future.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, John. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody stay safe, and hopefully we'll see you all in person before long. See ya.
Bye all.